Hello, and welcome to Old Ways in New Jersey. I'm Angus Kress Gillespie, your host. Our guest today is Randall Gabrielan, historian and prolific author. Today, we're going to talk about his latest book, an account of a local World War I disaster that killed 100 people, but has been virtually forgotten by history. His book is called Explosion at Morgan, and I'm pleased that it has brought Randall Gabrielan to our studio here in East Brunswick today. Randy, you've written books on Jersey City and Hoboken and Rumson, Atlantic Highlands, and many others. What led you to do this book on Explosion at Morgan?
I've lived most of my life in close proximity to two great World War I munitions explosions. First, I grew up in Jersey City, 2 miles from the Black Tom explosion, and I've spent most of my adult life about 10 miles from the explosion at Morgan. And it had long made me wonder, why is Black Tom so well remembered by history and Morgan virtually forgotten? I set out to solve that.
Okay. Tell us about the origin of Morgan and who was T.A. Gillespie.
T.A. Gillespie was an engineer who had some experience in the munitions field in the early years of World War I, prior to the American engagement. After America entered the war, the need for munitions had grown exponentially, and he was one of the few experienced hands, and he was charged with building one of 5 massive munitions plants to load shells, artillery shells, for the European theater.
And when you're loading an artillery shell, let me ask a naive question, or maybe a couple of naive questions. You have the base, which I guess is for the projectile, and then you have the warhead, which does the damage. Are there explosives in both parts of the shell?
Well, you fill the shell with the material that will send the warhead speeding to its target.
So that's the propellant.
That's the propellant. You have a propellant, a black powder, which will make the shell explode. And you also have a volatile material that will cause the warhead to explode on target. So what you see when you look at a shell is the tube on the bottom and the warhead on top. The tube, of course, remains after the shell is fired and becomes scrap metal.
Can you tell us a little bit about the cover of your book? I find it's a very haunting photograph.
The cover of the book is the shell of the home of Charles Steuerwald, who was a real estate figure in Perth Amboy, who was quite proud of his accomplishment of assembling the plot on which this 2,000+ acre plant was erected. It happened to be quite near his home. Perhaps he wasn't considering the danger of a munitions plant close to residences, and he paid for it with the loss of his home. Fortunately, the family was away at the time.
There's this kind of poetic irony in that, isn't there?
There certainly is. Yeah. He dropped reference to the plant in his post-war business briefs.
And when exactly did this explosion take place?
This explosion took place on the evening of Friday, October 4th, 1918. It was the evening shift, so there were no women munitions workers on the plant.
Were the shifts 24 hours a day?
The plant was running multiple shifts, yes. There was an urgent need for shells, and everything was production oriented.
And how many buildings were lost, or do we know how many buildings were lost?
Dozens.
Wow.
All of the or virtually all of the manufacturing facility was lost. There was also an extensive warehouse operation there for materials and finished goods. Some of that survived, and perhaps we'll bring that up in the post-explosion aftermath discussion.
Okay. Roughly, what was the amount of the financial loss?
It's hard to say. It was in the hundreds of millions, but of course there was a multiplier effect in what we understand the dollar to be worth today. So it would be dozens of times that, probably, no doubt, in the billions.
Wow, that much.
And of course 100 lives.
Yeah, well, yeah. And how much ammunition was lost? Because after all, there was a war going on. Then presumably the Army needed the ammunition.
Well, there were other plants that produced similarly, and we were near the end of the war, and there are statistics on production, although it would be hard to calculate lost production, but it was considerable. Interestingly enough, in the post-disaster sympathy for the plant, it was projected or claimed that they produced an enormous amount, a significant quantity of the munitions used in the war. But in practical purposes, their output from the time they went online to the explosion was about the equivalent of a weekend's usage in a major campaign.
Wow. Well, they came on relatively late in the war.
They came on in July, so they weren't in production very long.
What was the impact on nearby Sayreville?
The impact in the surrounding area was profound, particularly in South Amboy. Morgan is in the easternmost section of Sayreville. It is practically on, it is on Raritan Bay, and the surrounding area in Sayreville, the Morgan section, had to be evacuated, as was all of the city of South Amboy. This was a weekend-long event because the initial explosion was followed by spreading fire and multiple subsequent explosions that got increasingly severe and disastrous.
Now, you mentioned when we first began that you've been fascinated with Black Tom. Can you compare and contrast the Morgan explosion with the Black Tom explosion?
Yes. Black Tom killed relatively few people, about 7. The loss may have been equivalent. It's kind of hard to compare in property damage, but the proximity of that explosion, it was literally at the doorstep of the New York financial district, sent shivers throughout the area of the potential of the hazards of war. Now, Black Tom was in July of 1916, and this was prior to the United States entry in the war, and there lies a major difference in the nature of the explosions. Black Tom was proven to be caused by sabotage, whereas Morgan was an industrial accident.
Aha. And I believe you mentioned in the book that once the U.S. entered the war, the saboteurs were a little bit discouraged because sabotage in wartime brings a death penalty.
Yes, and that's an interesting point because prior to the passage of the Espionage Act, sabotage in the time of peace wasn't even a separate crime. The saboteurs had to be nailed on arson or some similar offense. And yes, the saboteurs did disappear because it was one thing to risk a jail term, but another thing to put your neck on the line. So while there were numerous instances of sabotage prior to our entry, typically industrial fires, there were very few afterwards.
And it's interesting what you said. Basically, the Black Tom was bigger in public consciousness because of proximity to New York.
Much bigger.
Yeah.
It occurred in Jersey City, where Frank Hague was getting his start as the director of public safety. He was concerned about his people, made some serious pronouncements on what could or could not happen in the city. He tried to throw out the munitions shippers, but it did leave a lasting effect of the wisdom of separating munitions operations from populated areas.
Of course. Was Black Tom a special case, or was there sabotage elsewhere?
There was sabotage elsewhere. The book enumerates a number of instances. There was one in the New Jersey Meadowlands at a place called Kingsland, part of Lyndhurst, where another plant prior to our entry was wiped out. There was no loss of life there, so that one wasn't as well remembered either.
And you said that the Morgan explosion was an accident, not sabotage. Do we know the mechanics of the accident?
Yes. Not everyone in the building with the initial blast was killed. So there were a small number of workers that were able to recount what happened. The workers were mixing some of the materials, a substance called amytal, which had to be heated to be put into a molten state for pouring in the shells. And one of the batches became overheated. And the worker, conscientious as he may have thought he was, did not do what he should have, which was put water on the batch to cool it off. He didn't want to lose the batch he was mixing. So
the water would have ruined it.
The water would have ruined the amytal mix. So there was a fire and an explosion, and the fire spread. Should I recount how it spread?
Yeah, to fill us in.
The plant had a fire department, and they had an extensive water system. However, after the blast at the initial building, described as 611, the buildings were identified by numbers, the water system was compromised. So they couldn't deliver water elsewhere in the plant. And consequently, it was difficult, indeed not possible at all, to check the spread of the fire. And there were subsequent blasts throughout. And the later blasts were much more dangerous and forceful than the initial blast.
And how did it happen that Morgan was so apparently close to these residential areas like Sayreville and South Amboy and Perth Amboy?
Well, it had some natural advantages. It was on a waterway, Quake Creek. It was on a railroad line, so materials could be delivered, workers could be brought in, and finished product could be shipped out to the harbor. So it had good natural qualities. What it had going against it was its proximity to a populated area. But Steuerwald obviously did a good selling job on selling the plant.
And proximity to built-up areas mean you have a supply of workers that you just mentioned. And wasn't it true, like one of the trains bringing the workers was sabotaged?
Yes, it was. And that was an example that showed just how far the saboteurs would go in attempting to disrupt the war effort.
Yeah.
I mean, they even burned cattle on a pier in Hudson County that was being shipped to Europe for food.
Now, in this chain of explosions, you said they tried to evacuate the local towns. How orderly was that evacuation?
Hardly orderly at all, in the sense that as many people that could get in as many vehicles or walk on as many paths out of town just went, often not knowing where they were going, but realizing they had to get away.
And In the book, I think you mentioned the Spanish influenza was going on at the same time. How did that impact the local scene?
That's a good question. It is thought by some who have studied it that the influenza increased the mortality of the explosion victims. On the other hand, many of them were out in the open, and the influenza was spread by being in close proximity.
Oh, exposure, because they had no place to go.
No place to go.
Oh, okay. Well, what remained of the facility once the flames were extinguished?
Once the flames were extinguished, the warehousing section of the plant remained intact. These were, well, storage buildings. The fire hadn't gotten that far. And we were so close to the end of the war, while they did make initial attempts to rebuild the plant immediately after the disaster, 5 weeks later, the war was over. And what was going to happen then? So much of this material that had been shipped to France was going to come back. And Morgan was used as a terminal for the returned material.
Aha. And how long did it continue to be a warehouse facility?
Oh, for about 3 years or so. And this, too, was a disruption to the local population for a couple of reasons. One, their fears.
Yeah.
Although there were no longer mixing shells, you still had these vast quantities of munitions coming into town. And secondly, you had a considerable number of soldiers that were, let's say, overpopulating the area.
So that's an impact.
That's an impact, yeah.
What was, backtracking a little bit, what's the difference between handling munitions before the war and after the war?
Well, before the war, you were actually mixing the materials, so it was a manufacturing process. After the war, you were handling already made materials where you didn't have heat, raw materials being poured. So the nature of the operation was different. Well, it was manufacturing versus storage. Yeah.
So it was safer, basically.
Well, I would say it was safer, but if you were living in the area and had experienced that massive weekend-long disaster, how safe would you feel? Merely because, oh, we're bringing in many, many cases of high explosives.
Yeah. So what was life like after the war at the base?
Well, after the base, you had a fair number of workers who were engaged in doing what you do to accept returned materials, and after hours seeking recreation and mixing with the locals. That's where it got a bit uncomfortable for the population of Sayreville and the Amboys.
Were there certain bars or taverns that catered to the munition workers?
Well, during the war, the taverns in close proximity to the plant were closed. After the war, I imagine anything went. But they did have considerable foresight about war workers and alcohol, but that's a whole other story.
Okay. What happened after the Army packed up and left?
The area of the plant declined to what was literally a wasteland. It was abandoned. Debris was strewn all over the area. You had some paths that were roads in the plant that were navigable, but it was a place where kids might play, but no one with any sense would venture because there was no reason to be there. Now, it wasn't planned to remain a wasteland as it was thought, this is during the boom years of the 20s, that it would be prime for real estate development. And it was even bought by some investors with that in mind. However, it didn't happen. There were many small, inexpensive lots in the surrounding area, and by the time the market was filled, the Great Depression came along, and the real estate market collapsed. So it stayed that way for another couple of decades, right through the World War II years.
So when did eventually development take place?
After World War II, in the 1950s. Sayreville is immediately south of the first town on the mainland south of the Raritan River on the Parkway. So Sayreville was a boom town after the Parkway was built, and they were running out of land. So they made real estate developments. They filled in the land, and you have some very nice developments on the former plant grounds. And I would venture to say most of the residents have no idea of the tragedy that took place there.
And if we were to take a drive over to Sayreville and look around, is there any remains of the old plant that we could see?
Very little. There is a remaining warehouse building in a boatyard that has been remodeled beyond recognition. There's a wall, a single wall of a building in that same yard. There's one structure left on Highway 35 in the Morgan area that dates from the plant era, but hardly recognizable as
And so you say, like, the people who live around there are almost unaware of all this?
Yes.
Okay. Has any unexploded ordnance been discovered in recent years?
In recent years, I don't recall any discovered in the last few years or since I wrote the book. However, knowledgeable locals believe that there is still material in the ground. And there's an explanation for that. When they were in a hurry to rebuild the plant, there were massive cavities in the ground. Enormous holes, and they just bulldozed everything in the surrounding area to fill these craters. So there was no doubt a fair amount of ordnance in there. The Army did an extensive study back in the 90s to try to identify it. The people had become worried, but let's be assured there are still shells in the ground.
And when you were wrapping up the project, was there anything that was unfulfilled that you would have liked to have done?
Yes. I thought there might be a memorial page or a short chapter to those who died there. But the names of at least half of the casualties were elusive, and they couldn't be identified.
Perhaps because the records were burned.
Perhaps because the records were burned. I'm sure a number of them were, well, blown to bits, and there were no remains, and of course, pre-DNA testing, no ability to identify someone from a small piece of flesh or bone. And a lot of the workers were transients, immigrants who didn't speak the language. And I actually had a query from someone who thought that a relative may have been lost there. The lack of knowledge at the time was profound.
Huh. Were you ever able to collect any of the shells yourself? Make a nice piece to put on the mantle?
Yes, they would, and many thought of that afterwards. I have no desire for same. I can point viewers to a museum that has them. Well, the Thomas Warren Museum in Old Bridge. But there was a thriving business in the reuse of shells, turning them into lamps and sculptural figures and the like.
Huh. But you're not interested?
I'm not interested in that. I deal with facts rather than relics.
Okay. And where can one get copies of your books?
Presumably in the major retailers or the typical online sellers or the publisher History Press or me.
Okay. I know you're a prolific author. What are you working on currently?
I'm working on a history of the Jersey Shore. Actually, two books. One, a major narrative analytical history, and the second, actually the first that will be published, is a work called Makers of the Jersey Shore, a book of profiles of people important to the development of the shore, people with stories that should be remembered.
Are these guidebooks to the shore?
No. The narrative history will analyze the background of the shore, and it will be unlike the guidebooks, which are so feature and amusement and vacation oriented. I want to tell the story of what made the shore from transportation, environmental, maritime, and visitation perspectives.
I know there have been books about the history of Atlantic City. Charlie Fennell wrote a book by the Beautiful Blue Sea.
That's a great book.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew him. We went to graduate school together.
Okay.
But you're just going to touch on Atlantic City. You're going to try and cover the whole shore, I presume.
Well, Atlantic City, of course, is a very important place, one where the history has been told often, so it will be represented there. And the history of Atlantic City is problematical.
And I presume you're going to talk about how different shore towns often attract different ethnicities.
Different ethnicities, different classes, and different personal profiles. And that's a good point because dotted along the shores are so many now independent boroughs that began as real estate developments.
And I presume also you're going to bring in popular culture, film and song.
Up to a certain extent as it relates to the various places. Asbury Park, of course, has a musical history. But one will be constrained by space limitations, and I'm going to try to attain balance and focus on what I think is truly important.
Well, Randy, I want to thank you for coming to East Brunswick and sharing this very interesting and often overlooked story about the explosion of Morgan.
I'm glad to be here, Dr. Gillespie. By the way, are you related to Thomas Andrew Gillespie?
Not that I know of, but that's an interesting thing to explore.
It's a large, proud family, and who knows what the ties might be.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.